And the recording will be placed online. So if you know of anyone who missed it, or if you want to go back to anything in the presentation, we'll be putting it on the project website. Because we are recording, we just ask that you do wait until the end of the presentation to ask any questions. If you think of them as Carissa's talking, you can put them in the chat. We'll make sure and come back to them. But then that helps us post online a good presentation. And then there will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carissa.
Thanks, Shauna. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this public meeting on our Resilience Hub Network initiative. My name is Carissa, and I am the Heat Mitigation and Resilience Specialist with the Sustainability and Resilience Office at the city. And my work is focused on building out this project. So I do ask that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat for later, or my Climate Action Manager, Brianne Fisher, will answer what she can, and then I can take other questions at the end. All right, so as a quick overview, we will be talking about why we're pursuing this project, how we can improve our community's resilience, our approach being resilience hubs, how we chose our current hub sites, and at the end, I will introduce a community feedback mapping survey to help us identify additional partners and trusted spaces for the work. So why are we pursuing this project? So there's a threat within the city of Tempe, and I'm sure that you all know what it is if you do live in the valley. It is extreme heat. So heat is the most common hazard that we experience in the valley, and both nationally and locally, extreme heat results in the most deaths compared to all other hazards combined. This hazard is projected to only increase in our future due to climate change and global warming, with new heat records expected to be broken each year. So with these higher temperatures comes hazards like heat waves, fires, and power outages. So as heat waves get longer, they can increase the severity of neighborhood and house fires, and it can increase the stress on our electrical grid due to air conditioning use for long periods of time. So when we're talking about hazards in Tempe, these are the main hazards that we're looking to mitigate and build resilience to. Also, with increased temperatures and a stress on our grid, we're seeing an overall increase in 911 calls for service during the heat months. So research highlights that in the summertime, when temperatures are higher, Tempe Fire Medical Rescue sees an increase in the number of calls that they need to respond to. And as you can see in this map, most of the heat-related dispatches in the city are in northern Tempe. So as you can probably assume, there is more stress on our northern first responders than our southern first responders. So overall, this emphasizes that extreme heat is affecting both our general population and our official emergency response within the city. So to give an example of what it looks like to respond to an emergency from some of the hazards that I just mentioned, we had a power outage in North Tempe last summer that affected over 400 residents during a 110+ degree day. So not everyone has the ability to get into their car and drive somewhere else to find cooling or other needed resources. There is this population amongst every neighborhood that needs a bit more assistance during these types of events. So to provide heat relief for these individuals, we sheltered them in our North Tempe Multi-Generational Center, where we provided cooling, food, water, bathrooms, and refrigeration for medication for 12 hours before that power came back on. So this is an example of what it looks like to respond to an emergency and the level of emergency we're preparing for with the hazards we experience in Tempe. It's this displacement of residents due to a hazard like a fire or a power outage during an extreme heat event. So to kind of piggyback off the example I just gave of not everyone having the ability to go somewhere else in an emergency, there are social and economic factors that contribute to an individual's ability to respond to everyday challenges and emergencies. We call these socioeconomic vulnerabilities. These are demographic groups that are more at risk to disasters because of historical, social, and economic inequities. These include those that are older, those living alone, minority populations, those at near or above the poverty line, populations without high school diplomas, and those with lower medium incomes. So people with these demographics typically experience more challenges in everyday life. So by offering opportunities to reduce those core vulnerabilities, those historical inequities, we can improve residential resilience to everyday challenges than to emergencies. So how can we improve our collective resilience to hazards and everyday challenges? we can build our community preparedness and response, and build our community social capacity and capital. So what does community preparedness and response look like? This looks like coordinating emergency response efforts between organizations, community members, and the city so that we can collectively provide health and safety during emergencies, even if official response might be limited. This can look like organizations participating in heat relief through cooling or respite centers. It can look like sheltering for the neighborhood if there's a power outage or a fire, or it can look like being a place for food or supply distribution. So just to give an example of food distribution during an emergency, so if there's a worker strike and people need food, that would be an example of stepping up when needed for those experiencing hardships. Or let's say there's a pandemic and there's a need for some supply distribution like masks or vaccines. That's an example of supply distribution. There's also this community member preparedness aspect of providing trainings and workshops so that we can prepare individuals like me and you for emergencies. So what does building social capacity and capital look like? So social capital is the network of relationships among people in our community. So by improving those networks, identifying and utilizing assets within the community, and working with the community serving facilities in our community to offer more relevant programs and services, we can overall build our resilience to everyday challenges and collectively reduce those socioeconomic vulnerabilities. So our approach to help build out that emergency preparedness and community social capacity and capital is resilience hubs. So resilience hubs are trusted community facilities designed to assist residents in their daily lives, respond effectively during emergencies, and aid in recovery. So by utilizing trusted spaces like community centers, places of worship, or educational institutions, these hubs can empower communities to achieve a wide range of physical and social objectives before, during, and after emergencies. So these types of community hubs are really important, especially as we're seeing new heat records being broken each year and seeing our emergency response teams push to new limits. So by having these trusted spaces that community members already go to every day to meet their daily needs and using those spaces to be central gathering points during emergencies, we can improve the community's resilience to respond and recover to disruptions. It's this bottom-up grassroots approach to emergency management that shifts the power and the confidence to local organizations to respond to emergencies when official emergency response might be limited. This shift of power lets organizations and residents coordinate emergency response efforts because they know what they need, they know who is vulnerable in their neighborhood, and they know what everyday services and those emergency services that they're going to need during emergencies. So the goal is to have a network of these community serving organizations and facilities, resilience hubs, that can stand up during emergencies and offer resources, but also most of the time, 99% of the time, serve their community on an everyday basis through offering programs and services and events that build social capacity and capital. So there are a few cities across America that are adopting the concept of resilience hubs. We're working closely with the city of Baltimore and the city of Austin to help lead this pilot of our network. The city of Baltimore focuses their hubs on faith-based organizations and nonprofits. These organizations provide food, education, and health services to their community every day. And the city is helping to develop ways in which they can prepare and plan for emergencies. The City of Austin's network mostly consists of city-owned facilities like their recreation centers and are training staff to respond to emergencies through trainings and workshops. And they're also collaborating with their community to ensure that programming is aligned with their needs. Then last, I wanted to highlight Puerto Rico's network, as their network of resilience hubs really encompass the concept of community-owned and operated. So with collaboration with the government and nonprofits, Puerto Rico's hubs are equipped with community-serving amenities like solar energy, generators, water storage, and gardens. And they also offer psychological services, emergency preparedness trainings, and other programs to their community. So because we're new to this initiative, We are really trying to take these best practices from other cities and thinking through what would work best for Tempe. So learning from other networks, the goal of Tempe's Resilience Hub network is to bring together community serving organizations that already do everyday programming and services for their community so that we can create a network of resource coordination and helping hands between city and community-owned facilities and official and unofficial emergency response. So the idea here is to bridge social gaps, share resources and ideas, partner on grants, offer preparedness trainings, and overall build relationships within Tempe so that we can all serve our community better, both during emergencies and every day. So how are we choosing our pilot resilient hub sites and how are we starting this work? So this work started as a highlight action in our climate action plan update in 2022, which our climate justice agenda identified resilient energy hubs and resilience hubs as immediate actions that are needed to improve community connections and our ability to respond to emergencies. So last year in 2023, we got funding from the City Council to assess 30 sites for microgrid feasibility as part of our Resilient Energy Hub Master Plan. So resilient energy hubs differ from resilience hubs because they have that backup power in place, that's solar plus battery storage for excess electricity that can be used in the event that the electrical grid does experience a disruption. So 10 of these sites are going to be police and fire stations. 10 are going to be community centers like our recreation centers and our multi-generational centers. And 10 will be community-led facilities. And the purpose of this study is to identify microgrid feasibility in places that house essential services that we want to ensure are covered by backup power. So in some, it might be a room to be a cooling center. We want to make sure that heat relief can keep going even if there's a power outage. For others, it might be ensuring that the kitchen is backed up by backup power so that the organization can continue to do their everyday hot meal food bank services. So to understand the places that should be part of this microgrid assessment, we are partnering with the Red Cross. We're doing some of our own internal facility and organizational assessments and having internal conversations with the organizations themselves as they know what their community needs most so that we can all collectively work together to identify what should be backed up in the event of a power outage so that that community serving facility can continue to serve their community in the way that is needed most. So I would just like to highlight that this is just an assessment, but we will continue to pursue funding in the future to kind of get those installed. So how are we choosing our 10 community-led sites? So we've been doing lots of outreach and engagement with organizations that already participate in community services. And those that are showing interest are our faith-based organizations. And we have a handful of committed organizations that really want to be relied upon in their community in this way. So far we have 8 organizations, faith-based organizations that are interested in being part of this work. And some of the criteria that we used, if they do want to participate and be part of this microgrid assessment and pilot this Resilience Hub initiative, is that they are in or will serve those in our heat priority areas. We also tried to spread and space these out from our recreation and multi-gen centers, just so relief is spread out across the city. And they also either have experience with iHelp, which is our TCAA sheltering program, where they shelter and provide food for 40 individuals a night per week. They might offer food distribution services daily through hot meal services or other food banks. Or they offer daily programming and services to the public outside of their normal faith services, such as daycare, health services, exercise classes, free laundry or shower services, etc. They also have groups dedicated to sustainability, resilience, or climate justice. So we have this microgrid assessment component, and we also have this emergency response, everyday programming and services component that we want to explore and pilot with these sites so that we can get them established as resilience hubs. Then once we've piloted these sites and figured out kind of a good plan to get them prepared to respond and act every day, We want to open this network to all organizations in Tempe that want to serve their community in this way. So, for example, the church down the street might not have a place for sheltering individuals during a power outage, but they do have a strong connection to an organization that provides water for cooling centers. So that's a great connection to have, and we want those connections to be part of this network. So first, piloting with those 8 faith-based organizations and city facilities, then opening it up to others that are interested in serving their community every day and during emergencies, whether that be through providing services or just providing an actual physical facility. So as an overview of the work, these hubs will be equipped with the confidence in offering heat relief, shelter, or food or resource distribution services during emergencies. So we'll be going through some assessments, some training, some planning sessions to get them prepared to respond by having an established plan that they can utilize. So this plan will help the organization identify gaps in their capacity and solutions for those gaps, utilizing assets from the network, their own connections, or city resources. So for example, right now, we're working with a handful of these faith-based organizations and our city-owned facilities to establish plans for heat relief this upcoming summer. And so that we can help them identify their gaps and how we can possibly fill those gaps. We will also be having some activities and conversations with the faith-based organizations to get them thinking about better serving their community every day, really trying to build that social capacity and capital, as this is the mode they will operate in 99% of the time. So as these facilities will be serving the public and the public's need in Tempe, we wanted to develop a platform where we could get the community's feedback on places in Tempe that you all trust that should be included in this work, either as a resilience hub or a support organization. This also will generally help us identify essential assets that members believe are valuable to the community. So these places can be grocery stores, parks, local restaurants, faith-based organizations, nonprofits, schools, or businesses. We really just want to get your feedback on what places you trust and go to frequently so that we can ensure that future network partners are aligned with community trust. So in the survey, you can map trusted spaces, you can map places that are vulnerable to heat, power outages, or flooding. And then you also have the option to take a more larger survey. It's only a handful of questions where you can provide your feedback on programming and services you would like to see at future resilience hubs. All right, so this is the link in the QR code to the survey, to the mapping survey. Brianne, if you could please drop that link in the chat. And I'll leave this up for a few seconds, and then after this, I will take any questions.
So for questions, you see where Bram dropped the link in, you can put them in the chat there, or feel free to come off mute and Carissa can answer them.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
David, we can hear you.
So I kind of have two comments. The first is about the city response part. You covered most of this in the presentation, but I just think it's really, really important to make sure that you get the communication, because I see these resiliency hubs as kind of like an emergency command center. And so making sure that you're able to coordinate communication, because the last thing you want is to have 200,000 people calling the city and you're basically spending more time, sending text messages and phone calls than actually responding to the emergency. And so it's like you might even have a place where you have 10, 20 computers and phone calls and phones, and to make sure that you're actually coordinating all of this information across the city. And you might even have employees that are trained in an emergency where, let's just say an example, I might be a park ranger, but I might also be trained at the resiliency hub. So if there's a 120-degree heat wave, I know where I'm supposed to be, and I know that I can be there taking those phone calls. And the other comment I have is from the community side, because a lot of this is going to be that we need to be prepared for a heat wave because we can't really depend on the city. In a worst case scenario, we could even be looking at where the hospitals could be overwhelmed with heat victims. So it's like we really need to do everything we can to be prepared. So making sure that you're educating us on what a heat kit looks like. We need to know what to expect. We need to know what to do. Things like, having ice packs in the freezer, having water at home, having snacks because we may not be able to cook. So we're going to need to be able to eat, and making sure, I have one last example, making sure that we call the cooling centers before we go, because the last thing that you want is to have 100 heat victims outside of a cooling center trying to cool down, and there's no room. And so making sure that we know to actually call before we go there to make sure that there's actually room for us. So those are kind of like the two ideas that I had. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. And we, piggybacking off what you said about making sure that our communication is in plan. So we're working with our Tempe Fire Medical Rescue emergency managers, our team there, to kind of develop this plan for communication, just to make sure that no party is overwhelmed if there is an emergency and that we have those plans in place. And then speaking of kind of training for the community, we're exploring ways that we can communicate and train and prepare individuals to respond to heat waves on their own, and what some of those things look like. So both of those things are on the radar and are in development. So thank you for saying that.
Any other comments or questions?
Hi, I have a question. Are there any sort of dedicated spaces or work to kind of allow maybe more privacy or just quieter areas for people with kids, or even like lactation rooms, or on the other side of the spectrum, people who are in the geriatric population who might need a little more sensitivity?
Yes, that's actually a conversation that we have had with our emergency managers, as we're thinking of ways to, for example, shelter individuals if there is like a power outage. Are there spaces within that facility that can have children? And most of these churches do have playgrounds and spaces like that as well. So those are conversations that we're having and trying to make sure that this is accessible to everyone and that needs are met and everyone's comfortable when they do go to these places during emergencies. So yes.
And then just a small note, I cycle a lot. So it's really nice when the bicycle parking area is somewhat shaded during some of the days. So if there's any way to position those even closer to the south side of or north side of the building, or even get its own shaded structure, that's always a nice touch. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. And because we are just starting this initiative, in the future, we want to start applying for grants to kind of get some of those resources and out at these hubs, and trying to identify with those organizations what those gaps are, what they see their mobility gaps being, and how we can pursue funding to kind of bridge those gaps. So that is on our mind as well. Thank you, Julie.
And then we do have a couple of comments and questions. Thank you, Brian, answered the CERT question, but did you want to go ahead, Brian, then and address the others, or?
I was reading Leslie's, but if Carissa can answer, go for it.
Yeah, give
So,
me a second to read it.
Carissa, I'll read it out loud just so we have it on the recording as well. So her comment is, we have a small church and we have a preschool meeting during the week. If there is an emergency and space is needed for people needing shelter, it wouldn't be available. And she's also concerned about the safety of the children.
That is totally understandable and something that has been coming up in our meetings as we've been having conversations with these organizations. We want this to be something that organizations feel comfortable with participating in, and we really want this to be something that they identify their capacity being. So if you don't feel comfortable being a shelter because of the children's safety, that or a cooling center, that's totally understandable. We want to be able to work with you and see what in other ways you could possibly serve that doesn't interfere with your current services. Because the last thing we want this to be is a burden or something that's concerning on the organization. It's up to them to identify the capacity, and then we can work with them to help kind of leverage what they want to get to in the future. I hope that answered it.
And then just for the benefit of the recording, I'm going to read the question on CERT and Brianne's answer so that everyone has that who might come back to this. And so Christiane had mentioned that the city has CERT emergency preparedness classes. She took one in Chandler and has a lot of what was mentioned. And then Brianne responded that the city's CERT program has not been up and running for a few years now, and that our fire medical rescue department was the owner of that program, and see the Resilience Hub Network initiative as a way to bring that education and training back to the community. So then for anyone else on the call, are there questions, any others? Again, feel free to come off mute, or you can put your question in the chat. And then not seeing any. Chris, I don't know if you want to go back to the slide with the survey or close this out here.
Sure, there we go. All right, and I guess just for my final remarks, thank you all for being here and for being interested in this work. We're still in our initial phases, but I'm so excited that so many people are interested in this, and I just look forward to working with everyone in Tempe and trying to make this a network for the community.